started. So this is work that's been done collaboratively between Zion National Park and USGS and the BAER program and Northern Arizona University. So as with any PowerPoint, the outline is pretty vague, but I'll go through an introduction, our project objectives, the methods, results and discussion, and then conclusions and management implications. And that's next. And the introduction. So this work is done in Zion National Park, which is in southwest Utah and is the intersection of 3 different deserts. It's characterized by deep sandstone canyons and high plateaus, and the vegetation ranges from arid grasslands to mixed conifer and aspen forests. In that little map in the bottom right corner, that white area is sort of this intersection of these 3 deserts, which you can see Zion National Park basically falls smack into, which means there's a lot of diversity in this area and a lot going on vegetatively in this in Zion National Park. Okay, next. We're going to be discussing cheatgrass, bromes in general, but cheatgrass is really the focus. It occupies greater than 40 million hectares throughout the West. It's a self-pollinating winter annual, which means basically it will grow in the fall, and then it will go dormant over the winter. It'll grow small, and then it'll really boost its growth in the spring. So it basically gets a jump on growth compared to a lot of our native species in the springtime. It's responsible for reduced richness and biodiversity. It preempts resource allocation and has ample seed production like many invasive species. And it alters fire regimes, which is really the main reason that we are looking at this study and what we did in Zion National Park. It reduces fire return intervals in many semi-arid systems, and it can create a grass fire cycle, which I'm going to talk about next. And that's it. Yep. So the grass wildfire cycle is recognized in semi-arid desert systems as well also in PJ systems. So what you're seeing here is a picture of a PJ juniper woodland burning in a woodland fire, and then normally it would have gone through successional stages of the introduction of annuals and then perennials and then moved into the pinyon and juniper coming back in, and over a 400 or plus year cycle we would have ended up with a pinyon juniper woodland again. However, if you could hit next, with the introduction of invasive annual grasses, we end up after these fires getting an invasion of cheatgrass or other invasive annual grasses. And that will then create a, I'm getting lost here. Okay, there we go. That will then create a homogeneous layer of fuels on the ground, which then promotes grass fires. And these fires are typically at a different season than were historically in these vegetation types, and also much more frequently, so that they actually promote themselves instead of the original vegetation type. So you could get a 3 to 5 year grass fire cycle instead of the 400 plus year pinyon juniper woodland fire cycle. This is clearly an issue because you've basically converted your PJ into an invasive annual grassland. There's been a number of things tried to control cheatgrass, from mowing to burning and grazing, and one of the things is herbicides. And one herbicide that has shown some promise in the recent literature in battling cheatgrass is imazapic, which the trade name is Plateau by BASF Corporation. On the label, it's labeled for weed control on pastures, rangeland, and non-cropland areas. Its use is pre- or post-emergent, although its suggested use is a pre-emergent. It has a half-life in the soil of 120 days, but that's pretty heavily debated and depends on your soils and the moisture in your soils. Excuse me. It inhibits productions of essential amino acids, which basically means that it hinders the addition of new tissues. So ideally, imazapic affects annual species more than perennial because annuals are putting on all new tissue all the time, and perennials are only adding tissue during certain times of the year. And it's been used throughout the West in rehabilitation projects. So you can go to the next slide. Zion had been using imazapic to battle cheatgrass in Zion National Canyon, and there's actually 2 previous research studies that have been done in Zion Canyon to look at imazapic use. One was done by Matchett et al. And O'Neill as part of a thesis, looking at combinations of burning, mowing, imazapic application, and native seeding. And basically the conclusions that came out of this is that fall burning followed by a fall herbicide application resulted in the best reduction in brome species, and fall burning followed by spring herbicide resulted in the highest densities of native species. And then another study, De La Cruz looked at different rates of imazapic with and without mulch in a nursery study, again related to Zion Canyon, and found that a moderate rate of 8 ounces per acre reduced brome species but had less of an impact on native species. So, and this rate is ineffective when mulch was present. So if you hadn't burned or gotten rid of your biomass somehow beforehand, this rate was not effective. Go ahead with the next slide. So with all of this information and this background on cheatgrass, the grass fire cycle, and attempts to control cheatgrass, Zion had the largest 2 fires in the history of the park in 2006 and 2007. The Kolob wildfire, which is the fire shown in red on the map on the right, which has green the perimeter of Zion National Park, and the Kolob fire in red. And then it's actually the Dakota Hills complex. It was a complex of several fires that you see in yellow. The Kolob fire started in June 2006, and it burned approximately almost 9,000 acres in the park, 75% Pirion-juniper and 25% shrubland grassland areas. The Dakota Hills fire burned approximately 6,000 acres in the park and was 25% Pirion-juniper and 40% mountain shrub, a lot of which means gamble oak communities. So these are going to be the focus of our study. You can go to the next. With these 2 large fires and with the concern of cheatgrass, basically the park brought in a BAER team for each of these different fires and looked at targeting bromous species because of the fear of the grass fire cycle in these Pirion-juniper systems and shrubland systems. This map is a zoom in of the Kolob fire, and the light blue shows the herbicide application, and the yellow shows a native seed application. The BAER team decided to apply imazapic aerially using helicopters on almost 8,500 acres of the park at 8 ounces per acre based on that previous study. And it decided to seed in the smaller area that's yellow hatched. And it's about 474 acres, and they seeded at 8.2 pounds per acre. The seeding was done because that area was known to be heavily pre-invaded with cheatgrass. And you'll note the perimeter of the fire does go out of the boundary of the park, which is the green line. Those areas are also very heavily invaded with cheatgrass. So there was a big worry that there was good propagule pressure to bring into this burned area and cause this possible type conversion. Next slide, please. The seeding treatment included 4 native species. It was 4 perennials, 2 grasses, and 2 forbs, and they were chosen for their pre-fire presence in the area, that they're early germinators, and they were hoped to be competitive with cheatgrass. And you can see it's basically globe mallow, Palmer's penstemon, Spiralis cryptandus, and Elenis elmoides, 2 grass species. Next slide, please. And then on the Dakota Hills fire, which was a year later, they also decided to do an imazapic aerial application via helicopter on 3,000 acres at the highest risk for cheatgrass invasion. And you can see it doesn't cover the entire burned areas, It's focused on high severity areas. There was a buffer on the park boundary and on water body areas as well. And again, it was done at 8 ounces per acre. No native seeding was done because the pre-fire cheatgrass presence in this area was lower according to a 2004 vegetation study that the park had done. So the overall objectives of this study is to determine the effects of the treatments on reducing cheatgrass in the understory, and to determine the effects of the treatments on the understory, that should say plant community. So we're looking both at the effects directly on cheatgrass and then the overall plant community. Biomass, cover, and density were used as measures for the understory plants, and biomass is supposed to be highlighted in blue there. You can barely see it. That is the major measure that I'll be talking about today. Go ahead. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the methods. So to reiterate our study sites, I'm going to be talking about 3 specific study sites today. We actually had more study sites than I'll be discussing today for the entire project, but I'm going to be talking about the Kolob Terrace site, which is on the left side in the Kolob fire. That is the area that was seeded and sprayed with herbicide, so native seeding and spray. The Dakota Hill site, also in the Kolob fire, is also Pirion-juniper. These are all Pirion-juniper sites, and just had the herbicide treatment. The Dakota Hill site on the Dakota Hill fire is in the treated area over in the top right corner of the park and on the very edge of the park, actually. Also a Pirion-juniper, and that one also includes a Gamble Oak site. I'm going to go through the study design of these 3 different study sites because they do vary a bit. The Kolob Terrace was Pirion-juniper, which was heavily invaded with Brome to start. That's why it was seeded. There are 11 blocks of 5 by 30 meter plots, and if you look at the map on the right, you can see the blocks laid out on the landscape. Within each of those blocks, you can were different treatments, and for some reason that got blacked out. But there was a control treatment, an herbicide only treatment, a seed only treatment, and then a combined seed and herbicide treatment. So it's a fully replicated study and a randomized complete block design. The plots themselves are 5 by 30 meters nested inside a buffered area for each treatment to help ensure the treatment integrity of our plots. Next slide. Seems to be having trouble transitioning.
You see it yet?
No, you can kind of half see it.
Okay.
It skipped a slide, but that's okay. Kind of doing something funny there. Well, there was a picture in between these 2 slides of the site that showed Pirion-juniper with basically a continuous understory of cheatgrass. It was taken just after the fire, but right on the perimeter of the fire in that Kolob Terrace area to give you a feel for the site. The study design for the Dakota Hill site is a paired plot design because there was only herbicide spray, there was no seeding. There's a picture to give you a feel for the site down below, post-burn. This site is Pirion-juniper with a Brome presence beforehand, but not heavily invaded like the Kolob Terrace site. We have 22 blocks or paired plots, and they're control and herbicide. Again, the 5 by 30 meter plots are nested within a buffered area to basically make sure our treatments were correct. Next slide, if I dare say. There we go. And then the study design at the Dakota Hill site is basically the same as it was at the Dakota Hill site. It was an herbicide-only application, except that we have 2 vegetation types. We have Pirion-juniper and Gamble Oak. And if you could go ahead and hit the button, hit the next slide, see if it works. The Pirion-juniper site is shown on the right with the gray and blue blocks. Again, there was a treated and untreated paired plot design. There's 17 pairs in the Pirion-juniper, and if you could go to the next slide, and 16 pairs in the Gamble oak, which are the yellow and blue plots on the side. The Gamble oak and the Pirion-juniper in both cases were chosen because they were highly representative of the burn areas and were areas that the park had an interest in understanding what was going to happen. The field methods for this study look very complicated, but basically entailed density and cover measures in 1 by 1 meter quadrats on the left side of that 5 by 30 meter plot, and then biomass destructive sampling on the right side of that plot. And then for the Gamble oak, because Gamble oak doesn't fit very well into 1 by 1 meter quadrat, we used cover transects down the center and the left side of the plot to assess Gamble oak cover. Soil samples were also taken, and we did 2 sampling seasons at every site, one in the spring and one in the fall. Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill were sampled from spring 2007 to spring 2010, and the Dakota Hill site was sampled from spring 2008 to spring 2010. Statistical methods, we basically had non-normal data across all the different sites, and so we used Permanova for both univariate and multivariate data analysis, and basically is an ANOVA where the p-value is permutated, so the outputs actually look very similar to a standard ANOVA. Next. Okay, so now we're going to move into the results in the discussion. And just to remind you of the different study sites and the progression that I'll be going through the results and discussion in, the Kolob Terrace and the Crater Hill sites will be KT and CH, and we're looking at the understory there. And then the Dakota Hill site will be discussed next, and the understory there. And those sites, again, on the map, you can see on the left the Kolob Terrace site and the Crater Hill site, and on the right, it's the upper right corner. Somehow the little thing didn't come through. So we're going to start with the Brome response to the herbicide in the seeding applications, and this is spring sampling data for the understory. This is a chart of the Kolob Terrace and the Crater Hill response. The white bars are the control. Seeded is the gray. The herbicide is the black. And the seed herbicide is the sort of marbled looking columns. And at Crater Hill there was no seed, so you simply have the control and the herbicide treatments. This is looking at biomass data. And what you can see is a clear herbicide effect at Crater Hill in 2008 and 2009. And if you look at the density and the cover data as well, we don't have the biomass data out there for 2007 and 10 as it's a more remote site and more difficult to get all our data. The cover and density data we do have, and it's basically both of those show the same trend here, and in 2007 a significant herbicide effect. 2010 in all cover and density has no significant effect. So we did seem to sample to the end of our capacity, but our end value is smaller there, so there's no guarantee. We'd probably need one more year of data to really know that we had done that. At the Kolob Terrace site, we have a herbicide and herbicide plus seed effect in 2007 and 2008. So you can see that the control is different than both the herbicide and seed plus herbicide in both 2007 and 2008. And the seed plus herbicide actually has a longer longevity in 2008 of being significantly different than the control and the seeded treatment. Next slide. This is the Dakota Hills site looking at brome biomass, and what you will notice is that there is basically no brome at either site, the Pirion-juniper site or the Gamble oak site. The Pirion-juniper site will always be on the left and the Gamble oak site will be on the right. The untreated is the open triangles and the treated are the dark circles, and this is by year. We had 1 year with a significant effect in 2009 at the Pirion-juniper site, but if you note, it's still less than 1.5 grams per meter squared of biomass, so very little going on there as far as the brome is concerned. Next. We're going to look at the seeded species response at Kolob Terrace only, and this is fall sampling data. Since all the seeded species were perennials, we felt the fall was a better representation of that data. You can see that the seeded species are significantly affected by the herbicide in both 2007 and 2008. The trend is not as clear in 2008 as it is in 2007. And the seeding treatment did appear to increase the seeded species in the first 2 years, even though that wasn't significant over the control. And I'm not going to spend too much time on these data slides because what I've done is summarize these all together at the end to try and stem some discussion. So I'm going to kind of move through these sort of quickly and then we'll get to the summary information. Next slide. And then we're going to move into the community response to herbicide and seeding. And this is again fall sampling season data for the most part. And we'll start with the non-native response. So at the Kolob Terrace and the Crater Hill sites, if you look at Crater Hill first, the control has significantly more non-native biomass than the herbicide-treated plots, which is a nice benefit. But if you look at the Kolob Terrace site, it's a little more confusing. The first year there's a significant effect of the herbicide in both the herbicide and seed plus herbicide plots. But then that disappears and we actually look like we have an increase in non-native species with the herbicide and seed plus herbicides trending, even though none of it's significant. But what's really going on is there's 2 non-native species at Kolob Terrace driving this pattern. Next slide. The first is prickly lettuce, or Lactuca serriola. In 2007, it was not present on the site. But in 2008 and 2009, it came in with a bang. And you can see that there seems to be an affinity of Lactuca to the herbicide sites. It's not significant, but there's a definite trend there. And that's what's causing sort of that confusion in the previous graph. And then the other species is red stem storkbill, or Erodium cicaterium. This has a clear herbicide effect in the first 2 years and then was not present in the 3rd year post-treatment. So Erodium does not like the herbicide, and so that's a nice side benefit to get rid of that non-native species. Next. At the Dakota Hill site, we saw a lot of the Lactuca as well, but the trend was actually slightly opposite of what we saw at the Kolob Terrace site. In the fall of 2009 and spring 2009, you see significantly less Lactuca with the herbicide. And the other seasons, the trend is not clear. So we actually have differing results on this one species at the different sites. This is also a kind of a fire-following weedy species that comes in, bolts, and then tends to disappear out of the system somewhat after a longer term, or at least reduce its amount in the system. So this just could be fluctuations in that weedy response as well. Next. Now we're going to move into the native response in the understory at Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill. So you can start with the Crater Hill again, and you'll see that there was a significant effect on natives in 2007 due to the herbicide, but that was not a significant effect in 2008 and 2009, but that the trend still does hang on. And then at Kolob Terrace, there's a significant herbicide effect in both the herbicide and the seed plus herbicide plots in 2007 as well, again with no significance in 2008 or 2009, but the trend of it has really disappeared by 2009. So that herbicide effect really, even seeing a trend, has disappeared by the 3rd year. And that pattern that you're seeing is primarily driven by perennials. We had few to no annuals on either the Kolob Terrace or Crater Hill site in the fall season data. We haven't looked at this yet in the spring data, and I'm sure that will change. The native perennials were significantly affected in 2007 only on both the Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill sites, which basically follows the exact same pattern. The graphs almost look exactly the same as the overall native response. There were few native annuals, so no significance in either year at either site. There was a significant effect on native grasses in 2007 only, but it was between the seeded and the control sites at Kolob Terrace, and a significant effect on native forbs in 2007 only, so at Kolob Terrace. And then if you look at Crater Hill, there were no significant effects on native grasses or native forbs in any year. And that could be a sample size problem as well as an actual true effect. But overall, if you look at the effects in the Kolob fire at these two sites on natives, we're primarily seeing it in 2007. Some of the trends tend to exist into 2008 and 2009 depending on the site, but the statistical significance is only in 2007, which is good news. Next slide. And then we're doing the native response at Dakota Hills. You can go to the next. The story here is a little different on the Dakota Hill site, and we'll get to some reasons as to why in a little bit. My screen just went blank. But overall, lower native species richness on treated plots was found in both the Pirion-juniper site and the Gamble oak site in virtually every season that sampled. So here we have data from both spring and fall, and particularly at the Pirion-juniper site, you see much lower lower native species richness in the Pirion-juniper site, and significantly in 2 seasons at the Gamble oak site. Next slide. The biomass of native species was significantly lower in the herbicide-treated sites, and overall lower the trend in the first 4 seasons there. In spring 2010, the treated and untreated areas seem to be converging when it comes to native species biomass. Next slide. And then if you look at perennials versus annuals at this site, we also are showing lower biomass of native annuals and perennials. Now remember, we mentioned that ideally plateau has more effects on annuals than perennials, but here we're seeing actually a stronger effect on the perennials at this site than on the annuals, but both annuals and perennials have lower biomass due to the herbicide. Next slide. And then if you look at shrubs, if you look at Gamble oak and alone, and this is cover on those cover transects, there is no effect of the herbicide on Gamble oak. It's apparently this is such a strong sprouting species with such great underground resources that we didn't see any trends of even a trend of the herbicide having an effect on this. However, if you look at all the other shrubs excluding Gamble oak, particularly on the Gamble oak site, there is a significant effect of the herbicide on other shrubs. Next slide. And then to look at the overall community effects, so this is a multivariate run where we look at all the species in the community and look at whether those differ by treatment type. At the Kolob Terrace and the Crater Hill, Kolob Terrace, we had a significant effect on the community in 2007, meaning the species composition in 2007 varied by treatment, and it was, again, the herbicide and herbicide plus seed plots that varied in composition from the seeded only and the control plots. In 2008 and 2009, there was no significance on the overall plant community composition. At Crater Hill, in 2007 and 2008, there was a significant herbicide effect on the overall plant community, and in 2009, there was not a significant effect. And then at Dakota Hills, in the Pirion-juniper site, we didn't have enough data in 2008 to look at this, but in 2009, there was a significant herbicide effect, and then 2010, that herbicide effect was gone. And again, in the Gamble oak, it's the same, basically the same pattern where in 2008 and 2009, we see a significant herbicide effect on the plant community, but by 2010, the plant communities seem to have converged back to be similar. So that is also good news that we're not seeing, this is about a 2.5-year effect at Dakota Hills and about a 1 to 2 year effect at Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill on the plant community. Next slide. So now we're into conclusions and management implications. And I'm going to go through these by the types that we talked about. So overall, the brome effects, seeding alone did not affect brome biomass. The herbicide effect on biomass density and cover lasted for around 2 years at Kolob Terrace and 3 years at Crater Hill. And this is on brome. At Kolob Terrace, the herbicide plus seed treatment tended to have a longer effect on brome abundance than just the herbicide alone. So we did see some additive benefit of the seeding and the herbicide over just the herbicide. And then at the Dakota Hill site, we had virtually no brome, but did have one season with a significant decrease in the Pirion-juniper site in brome. So overall, the herbicide did affect brome. It did reduce it. The length of the effect seems to depend on the amount of vegetation on the site, and the combination of herbicide and seeding tended to last longer in some cases. So the Kolob Terrace site, if you look at the biomass graphs again, has higher biomass overall on the plots than the Crater Hill site. And so one idea here is that the reason the herbicide effect on the brome did not last as long there is because it was taken up into a lot of that plant biomass. Whereas there's not quite as much of that at Crater Hill, and so the effect seems to have lasted longer. Now, with 120 days that this stuff is supposed to half-life, really at 3 years we wouldn't really expect to have any of that left in the soil. But there was still, whether it's just a residual effect or there's some levels of that herbicide residue left in there, we were seeing an effect at Crater Hill. Next slide. The seeded species, trends show increases of seeded species in the seed-only plots, which is what you would hope for, but it's not significantly different than the controls. So we really have no evidence that the seeding did better than nature itself. The seeded species were also hit very hard by the herbicide, so there was a clear herbicide effect on the seeded species. The seeded and herbicide plots had very low seeded species presence, as low as just the herbicide alone. And one idea that Hondo, one of the graduate students on this project, has thought about is, what about a fall herbicide application after the burn, followed by a spring seeding, so that you have the hit on the brome, it comes up early in the spring and absorbs the bulk of that herbicide, and then seed at that point to give the native perennials less of a hit from the herbicide. So that's something I'd like to discuss and see if anyone's tried that anywhere. We can discuss that at the end. The non-native response. There was not a clear trend on an overall non-native species. However, Erodium cicaterium is negatively affected at Kolob Terrace, and Lactuca serriola seems to do better in herbicide-treated plots at one site, but tends towards less biomass with herbicide at another site, and that just may be more of the life strategy of these plants than it is an herbicide effect necessarily. Next. The overall native response, herbicide significantly affected biomass at Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill. The trends are seen into 2008 at Kolob Terrace and into 2009 at Crater Hill. So again, on the natives as well as on the bromes, the herbicide effect tends to linger longer at Crater Hill than it does at Kolob Terrace site. And at Dakota Hills, at both the Pirion-juniper and the Gamble oak sites, we see overall lower native species richness and lower native biomass on treated plots due to the herbicide. So not good news there. So take-home messages. Natives were absolutely harmed by the herbicide by using imazapic. The length of the effect seems to depend on two things, and this is completely observational. One is the amount of vegetation, and two, the amount of pre-fire cheatgrass and or how intact the native community was to start. The Dakota Hills site was a relatively intact native site with very little presence of cheatgrass known before the fire. according to the 2004 vegetation survey done in the park. So these may be areas where we want to avoid the use of imazapic for cheatgrass control, especially if there's not much cheatgrass to control. There was worry about propagal pressure and it coming in post-fire, but we really didn't see that happen. Next slide. Native, annual, and perennials. The general trends follow the overall native response, particularly for perennials, except that the annuals trend was not quite as strong. We had reduced biomass, but we didn't see that as much in 3 seasons at Dakota Hill. So the annuals didn't seem quite as affected. There were very few annuals at Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill in the current data set, which was the fall data set. We hope to analyze this also with the spring data set at this site to get a better grasp on this. But overall, annuals and perennials were both affected by the herbicide. And unfortunately, the enzymes and the way that imazapic is supposed to work still had some pretty tremendous effects on the perennials. Next. And then these are overall observations. And note that's the word observations because we don't have a lot of data to back up this. But there are definite site differences. Kolob Terrace was heavily invaded with lots of plant biomass before the fire. Crater Hill somewhat invaded with cheatgrass, but less plant biomass overall than Kolob Terrace. And Dakota Hill was a relatively intact system with very little brome to start. The herbicide seems to have longer lasting effects with less plant biomass. We saw the longest lasting effects at Crater Hill and at the Dakota Hill site than the Kolob Terrace site. The herbicide hits natives very hard at the intact site. There was no cheatgrass to absorb the effect of that herbicide, and thus it went straight to the natives. The herbicide plus seed made a difference in the heavily invaded site, which had high pre-fire cheatgrass amounts, and the herbicide effect overrides the seeding effect. However, we did see the combination of herbicide and seeding, so that is a little confusing. All right, next. So take-home management implications. Imazapic does provide for a short-term restoration window. It can impact non-target species, should only be used on highly invaded areas, or I would even say partially invaded areas, and could be used as a follow-up measure. Seeding in conjunction with imazapic may benefit from the incorporation of a time lag. In the seed bank data, which I didn't present here today, we see Sporobolus cryptandius, one of the seeded species, did very well overall, and thus maybe giving it a time lag with the herbicide, we might see a really good response of this species, and there may be others like that. Next slide. Imazapic adversely affects many native species. We get reductions in overall vegetation and richness. The negative impacts do appear to be disappearing after about 2.5 years or earlier on certain sites. And for the overall community changes, 2.5 years or less also seems to be where we see the effects of the herbicide disappearing. It's important to understand the pre-fire community, how much cheatgrass dominance you have in the first place, and the presence of native species. And it's really important to understand that imazapic is not our golden spike. It's not going to eliminate cheatgrass. It may provide a window that allows native species to respond. But among these 3 sites, that's relatively questionable, and it has a lot to do with the pre-fire status. Next slide. Should be my last slide. Second to last slide. Did we make a difference? So these are things that I'd like to come back to this slide for discussion. At the Dakota Hill, which we're considering the relatively intact site before the fire, the herbicide caused more damage than it helped. However, the community effects seem to be disappearing 2.5 years post-treatment. At the Kolob Terrace site and the Crater Hill sites, was the slight reduction in brome worth the reduction in native species, even the short-term effect on native species? and was a window created at the Dakota Hill Site in particular with a 3-year effect on brome and a reduced effect on the natives after the first year. If we had thought about seeding, maybe that would be a site to think about seeding. And did we really overall reduce brome enough to stop the grass fire cycle? So with that, we'll go to the last slide. I just want to acknowledge our funders were the National Park Service, BAER program, and the Joint Fire Science Program. And we had a lot of help from the BAER team, Zion National Park, the USGS Western Ecological Research Center, and folks here at NAU in ERI. And then we had a tremendous number of field, lab, and greenhouse workers that made this possible. So with that, I'd actually like to go back to the previous slide and open this up for discussion, particularly surrounding those questions, and to see if anyone else has questions. And I did a horrible job at answering people's questions as I went along, didn't I? I apologize for that.
Okay, everyone else is off mute, so people can sort of voice their questions. And Andy, if you, I can't see the chat because I've got the PowerPoint up on my machine, but maybe you can check the chat too.
Okay. So Mark Tucker said the length of the effect depends on desirable vegetation competing with the brome. So I believe that question is getting at, we're hoping that it's natives competing with the brome and not other non-natives. Is that where you were leading?
Yeah, I was just wondering what you had talked about vegetation competition as being part of the success. I was just thinking you had some success restoring desirable vegetation as part of these treatments. In other words, that was a driver in determining your success, was the ability to get desirable vegetation competing with the brome?
Yeah, so that was some of the original objectives of the park of doing the herbicide spray in the first place. And Cheryl, feel free to jump in, but really the idea was we knew brome wasn't going to disappear, so to give it to stall it so that the native species would have a chance to get a foothold in the system again and possibly outcompete the brome. And I don't know with the data sets that I've shown that we could really say that at this point, but the window of the effects on the brome compared to the window of the effects on the native does lead to a hope that is the case.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. And then Cindy, were you able to consider site conditions, i.e. precipitation? We do have precipitation from all of these, and I didn't present that due to the time frame of this. But some of the responses in year-to-year variation certainly are linked to precipitation. But the overall treatment effects that I showed you were within year treatment effects, so that you can basically rule out precipitation in that sense when you're looking at the overall treatment effects. Was that what you were getting at?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Dave, the manufacturer of this herbicide has tested the effects of the herbicide on a number of plant species. Were any of the 4 species used for seeding tested prior to seeding? Do you think the seeding rate was high enough to produce significant enough results? And Cheryl, I might throw this one to you a little bit, particularly on the seeding rate, because I'm not sure what went into the decision process as to the rate of seeding, but I know there was some pre-experience and data that went into that.
As far as the species choices, can you guys all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The species choices were due to ones that we had tried in the main canyon. We hadn't ever tried it up in that area before, but we had found them to be resistant in our trials in the main canyon. So they weren't tested by the company, but they were sort of tested by us in a non-scientific way, if that answers that question. As far as the rate, it was partially ballpark, but it wasn't very scientific. It was based on some standard native seeding rates combined with what we could find. We had some pretty strict criteria for the species that we wanted to use. We knew they would work aerially, for instance, because things like Indian rice grass were resistant to imazapic, but they would not work for aerial seeding. We also try to keep the genetic integrity pretty solid in the park, and so we tried to find local seed. So we didn't have a lot to work with, and what we ended up with was kind of a combination of all of those factors. We also just, for your information, it was approximately 8 pounds of seed, but we also mixed that with about 10 pounds of rice hulls because we had such huge variation in the size of the seed. The elemus was huge and the sporobolus was very small, so to get that to disperse, we had to use a carrier, an inert carrier. Does that answer the question?
Dave, are you still on? I thought it answered the question.
Okay, Andy.
And then, Rance, these are good questions. With your data, you could make more objective decisions about application in the future. And, you know, that was really the hope. This was a pretty proactive move by the Park Service, I think, to invest the amount of money and time into monitoring these treatments that were done. This is, for what we know, particularly in the Park Service, the first landscape scale application of herbicide, and so they felt it was really important to monitor it, and I'm glad because I think we've learned some very valuable information. Anything to add to that piece? Dana, when do you think the seed bank data will be available for dissemination? It's actually in very good shape, and those were unfortunately the slides I cut right before I started because I just really wanted to talk about it all and I didn't have time. So that is in those revisions for publication, and we're hoping to submit that. We have to submit to USGS first and then after that. So it'll still be a little bit, but certainly if you are directly interested in that, we might have some PowerPoints that we'd be willing to share where you can see some of the preliminary analysis.
Great, thank you.
But please remind me.
Well, you're presenting at the George Wright Society?
I am, and I haven't decided because that's a very short time frame compared to this. I haven't decided which aspect of that I'm going to be presenting. But I certainly could also send you a copy of Hondo's thesis, which was all on the seed bank.
Thank you.
Cyan. In areas where seeding increased native species abundance, have you had a chance to look at correlations with native species and Brotech abundance biomass? No, and this is something I was thinking about when I was putting together this presentation, is that, you know, not only do we seem to see a more negative effect on the species with the less brome presence, that we might see some correlation there. Was that what you're getting at?
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
And do people have other questions, or you know, I think the last question that I threw out here, did we really reduce brome enough to stop the grass fire cycle, is a pretty key question when it comes down to whether or not we made a difference in this study. And I was kind of curious on what other people's opinions were on that. If you have them, not to put you on the spot or anything. I'm not sure that what we have here is. Primarily because if you look at our Kolob Terrace site, which was the most heavily invaded site to start, somehow we still only had cover of 6% when you look at the data in the first post-fire year, and then up to, I think it's 40% or so after that. But where is the break? No one's really been able to study where the break is on what cheatgrass cover or what understory cover will carry fire. And to break that fire grass cycle, we really have to break the point. We have to find that threshold and know where it is and break it. That makes sense?
I think that threshold is the next step, Andy. And I think that's one of the things we've learned from this whole process. I also think we've learned that heavily infested areas, a one-shot deal isn't going to do the trick. But, you know, maybe in the lesser infested areas, like out in the Crater Hill area, it seems to me like it might have been worth it. But in areas like on the KT Road, we should have done a subsequent treatment, maybe at lesser rates, so that the natives would have had a better chance to.
Yeah, or even with the idea that Hondo had is, you know, that there was an apparent window where the Brome effect was longer than the effect on the natives, and that was both at Kolob Terrace and Crater Hill. That window was larger at Crater Hill, which I think means that sites like that, which aren't completely infested but do have a strong presence of cheatgrass, are good candidates for where this might actually be helpful if you can afford the hit on the natives in the short term. But at the Kolob Terrace site, I'm wondering if Hondo's idea of seeding after the herbicide treatment the next spring, and having maybe the follow-up treatments even just be seeding treatments. And I don't know if anyone has tried that anywhere. And I think we probably have a lot of folks from a lot of different areas that have been working on the cheatgrass issue. Has anyone seen that tried anywhere?
This is Cheryl again. The only problem I see with that approach is that what I found with the natives is that sometimes they need even two seasons of winter stratification before you can get them to germinate, and by then you've lost your window. Possibly not, but possibly, depending on soils and rainfall.
That's true. Yeah. I don't know. It might be interesting to look at it at a very small scale.
Yeah, I agree.
And Hondo's seed bank study did point out some probable species that would be good to think about as far as competition and doing well based on this study.
That's true, because the Sporobolus doesn't seem to need that winter stratification.
No, and it sure took off pretty quickly, and it was the bulk of the seeded species that we saw in the seed bank study. We haven't looked at that in the above ground study yet, but it is something I intend to do.
Okay, this is Xander, and we sort of try to shoot for an hour on these webinars, and maybe now is a good break. I think if people have follow-up questions, Andy's probably open to some emails or some suggestions. And what we'll do is we'll post a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF of the slides on the website. And I think our goal, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, is to put on the same place on the Southwest Consortium website some updates, peer-reviewed papers as they come out. So if there are parts of this that you want to incorporate into your management or to write into NEPAs or something, and you feel like you need the scientific citations to kind of back that up, we're going to try to make sure that we serve that out to people via the same mechanism. So any last comments or questions that we need to take care of before we sort of let everybody go?
Yeah.
No, I thought it was a good session. I think you ought to do more.
I have a question. This is Eric from Zion. I work with Cheryl. I was just kind of curious about just casual observations. It seemed like 2007 was an extremely hot, dry year. We had more fires that year. It was really hot. And the next year, just driving around by the Dakota Hill area, it seemed like there was a lot more, like a lot of globe mallow in particular had come up. It seemed like a very, just seemed like a lot of things were going on during that 2008 season with natives and plants coming up. I was just kind of curious if anything in the data showed anything, concerning those kind of observations, issues. It seemed like in 2007 it would be hard for any type of native to germinate under the conditions that year.
Yeah, and if you look at the data on the seeded species actually did fairly well in 2007, but not better than the control. So, had you had good precipitation that year, maybe you would have seen a seeded species effect without the herbicide. But the main thing is that the herbicide, once you put it in there, it overrides that effect tremendously. I have not looked at year-to-year variance in any of these things because of the non-parametric, the non-normal data that we have. Trying to do some sort of repeated measures analysis across years is much more complicated, and I'm still trying to figure that out if we're going to be able to do that or not.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
Well, I want to thank you, Andy. That was a great presentation. It's great to see the data kind of as it comes out, and it seems really relevant to inform some management decisions. So I appreciate your presentation. And I also wanted to apologize for the kind of rough start, but thanks to everybody for sticking with it, and we'll improve next time around. So with that, I'm going to close it and kick everybody off with the phone line and the webinar, and the materials will be posted on the Southwest Consortium webpage. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.